What's going on, guys? So in today's video, we'll be exposing the 2015-16 NBA voters whose ballots were made public by the NBA on May 25th, 2016. And to start, we'll be looking at the Defensive Player of the Year voting, starting with Bill Worrell of Root Sports Southwest, who was the only voter in 2016 that kept Kawhi Leonard of the San Antonio Spurs completely off of his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, and instead gave Trevor Ariza of the Houston Rockets his one and only Defensive Player of the Year vote, which isn't surprising considering the fact that Bill Worrell has been the Houston Rockets' play-by-play announcer for the last 30 plus years. Next, we have Rudy Gobert of the Utah Jazz, whose only second place Defensive Player of the Year vote, which was his highest, came from Jody Genessy, who covers the Utah Jazz for the Deseret News. However, for many of these other Defensive Player of the Year voters, the inconsistency on their ballots can better be observed when their Defensive Player of the Year votes are put alongside their all-defensive team selections. Like Ted Davis of WTMJ Radio, who had Draymond Green second on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, second to only Kawhi Leonard amongst forwards, but then put Draymond Green on his all-defensive second team behind Tony Allen of the Memphis Grizzlies. Which doesn't make sense, especially when that's juxtaposed to a consistent ballot like that of Ian Eagle of the Yes Network, who also had Draymond Green second on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, second to only Kawhi Leonard amongst forwards, but unlike Ted Davis, had the presence of mind to put Draymond Green on his all-defensive first team alongside Kawhi Leonard. And while most of the voters that season were consistent with their ballots in that regard, a few weren't. This includes Mike Rice of CSN Northwest, who had Chris Paul of the Los Angeles Clippers third on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, first amongst guards, but then put Chris Paul on his all-defensive second team behind Russell Westbrook of the Oklahoma City Thunder and Avery Bradley of the Boston Celtics. Then there's Steve Holman of Hawks Radio Network, who had Paul Millsap second on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, second to only Kawhi Leonard amongst forwards, but then chose to put Paul Millsap on his all-defensive second team behind Draymond Green. Meanwhile, Ron Tillery of the Memphis Commercial Appeal had Rudy Gobert third on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, first among centers, but then chose to put Rudy Gobert on his all-defensive second team behind Tim Duncan of the San Antonio Spurs. Next, we have Bob Rathbun of Fox Sports South, who had DeAndre Jordan of the Los Angeles Clippers third on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, first among centers, but then put DeAndre Jordan on his all-defensive second team behind Andre Drummond of the Detroit Pistons. Then there's Sherrod Blakely of CSN New England, who had DeAndre Jordan third on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, second to only Hassan Whiteside among centers, but then chose to keep DeAndre Jordan completely off of his all-defensive second team ballot. Next is Bill Land of Fox Sports Southwest, who had Hassan Whiteside of the Miami Heat second on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, first among centers, but then put Hassan Whiteside on his all-defensive second team behind DeAndre Jordan of the Los Angeles Clippers. Meanwhile, Gary Gerold of CSN California and Mike Tricio of ESPN had Hassan Whiteside third on their Defensive Player of the Year ballot, first among centers, but then put Hassan Whiteside on their all-defensive second team behind DeAndre Jordan. Then there's Aaron Falk of the Salt Lake Tribune, Sage Steele of ESPN, Sam Amick of USA Today, and Steve Buckhantz of CSN Mid-Atlantic, who had Hassan Whiteside third on their Defensive Player of the Year ballot, first among centers, but then kept Hassan Whiteside completely off of their all-defensive first and second team ballots. However, what we also observe when looking at some of these ballots are hometown voters. Like Eddie Sefko of the Dallas Morning News, who gave Wesley Matthews of the Dallas Mavericks his one and only all-defensive vote that season, which isn't surprising considering the fact that Eddie Sefko covered the Mavericks as a beat writer for almost 20 years. Then there's Bismack Biyombo of the Toronto Raptors, who received his only all-defensive vote from Jack Armstrong, who works for the Raptors on TSN. Meanwhile, Derek Favors of the Utah Jazz received his only all-defensive vote from Jody Genessy, who has been covering the Utah Jazz as a beat writer for over 20 years. And please keep in mind that Jody Genessy was the only voter that season to have 2 Utah Jazz players on his all-defensive ballot. Next, we have Luc Mbah a Moute of the Los Angeles Clippers, who received his only all-defensive vote from Michael Smith, who was the color analyst for the Clippers on Prime Ticket at that time, and was also the only voter that season to have 3 Los Angeles Clippers players on his all-defensive ballot. Now, other questionable ballots that season include Cedric Maxwell of 98.5 The Sports Hub, who was the only voter that gave Dwayne Wade of the Miami Heat an all-defensive vote, while Stephen Curry of the Golden State Warriors received 10 all-defensive votes that season, which was the same as his teammate Andre Iguodala, as well as Patrick Beverley of the Houston Rockets, and more than John Wall of the Washington Wizards, and Marcus Smart of the Boston Celtics. Next is the NBA's Most Improved Player of the Year voting, where Marcus Smart's teammate Jay Crowder received his only first-place Most Improved Player of the Year vote from Mike Gorman of CSN New England, who has been the television play-by-play commentator for the Boston Celtics for over 30 years. Meanwhile, Gary Harris of the Denver Nuggets received his 2 Most Improved Player of the Year votes from Jason Kosmicki of the Altitude Radio Network, who has been the Nuggets' play-by-play announcer for over a decade, and Scott Hastings, who provides color commentary for the Nuggets on the Altitude Sports TV network. And please keep in mind that these were also the only 2 voters that season who had 2 players from the Denver Nuggets on their Most Improved Player of the Year ballot. Next, we have Andre Drummond of the Detroit Pistons, who received his only first-place Most Improved Player of the Year vote from Rod Beard of the Detroit News, who has been the beat writer for the Pistons since 2015. Hassan Whiteside of the Miami Heat, on the other hand, received his one and only first-place Most Improved Player of the Year vote from Jason Leisure, who was covering the Miami Heat for the Palm Beach Post at that time. And last but not least is Brian Scalabrine of CSN New England, who was the only voter that season to have Russell Westbrook of the Oklahoma City Thunder on a Most Improved Player of the Year ballot, where he gave him a second-place vote. Next, we have the NBA's Coach of the Year voting, where Billy Donovan managed to receive his one and only Coach of the Year vote from Brian Davis of Fox Sports Oklahoma, who was the television play-by-play announcer for the Oklahoma City Thunder at that time. Meanwhile, Doc Rivers of the Los Angeles Clippers received 3 Coach of the Year votes that season, 2 of which came from media members who were covering the Clippers at that time. One being Brian Seaman, who was covering the Clippers on radio, and Michael Smith, who was the color analyst for the Clippers on Prime Ticket. Now, when it comes to the NBA's Rookie of the Year voting, the only questionable ballot came from Tim Kempton of KTAR Radio, who was the only voter that kept Kristaps Porzingis of the New York Knicks completely off of his Rookie of the Year ballot, and instead chose to vote for Nikola Jokic of the Denver Nuggets and Devin Booker of the Phoenix Suns, which isn't surprising considering the fact that Tim Kempton is the Phoenix Suns' radio analyst. And please keep in mind that Tim Kempton was also the only voter that season who gave Mirza Teletovic of the Phoenix Suns a 6th Man of the Year vote. Now, the next set of ballots that we'll be looking at are from the All-NBA teams, where Antonio Harvey of Fox Sports Radio was the one and only voter that season who kept Kevin Durant of the Oklahoma City Thunder completely off of his All-NBA ballot, and instead chose Draymond Green of the Golden State Warriors, LaMarcus Aldridge of the San Antonio Spurs, Dirk Nowitzki of the Dallas Mavericks, and Paul Millsap of the Atlanta Hawks. Then there's Andrew Bogut of the Golden State Warriors, whose one and only All-NBA vote came from Diamond Leung of the Bay Area News Group, who was the beat writer for the Warriors at that time, and was also the only voter who had 4 players from the Golden State Warriors on his All-NBA ballot. Next, we have Brook Lopez of the Brooklyn Nets, who received his only All-NBA vote from Brian Lewis of the New York Post, who was covering the Brooklyn Nets as a reporter at that time. Now another questionable All-NBA ballot that must be pointed out comes from Jim Barnett of CSN Bay Area, who was the only voter to have Blake Griffin of the Los Angeles Clippers on an All-NBA ballot, despite the fact that Blake Griffin played in just 35 games that season. However, for many of these voters, the inconsistency on their ballots can better be observed when their All-NBA selections are put alongside their MVP votes. Like Tom McGinnis of Sixers Radio, who had Russell Westbrook second on his MVP ballot, second to only Stephen Curry amongst guards, but then chose to put Russell Westbrook on his All-NBA second team behind Chris Paul of the Los Angeles Clippers. Which doesn't make sense, especially when that's juxtaposed to a consistent ballot like that of Chris Dempsey of the Denver Post, who also had Russell Westbrook second on his MVP ballot, second to only Stephen Curry amongst guards, but unlike Tom McGinnis, had the presence of mind to put Russell Westbrook on his All-NBA first team alongside Stephen Curry. And while most of the voters that season were consistent with their ballots in that regard, a few weren't. Now the first set of voters that we'll be looking at are those who had Kawhi Leonard third, fourth, or fifth on their MVP ballot, second to only LeBron James amongst forwards, but then chose to put Kawhi Leonard on their All-NBA second team behind Kevin Durant of the Oklahoma City Thunder. These voters include Mark Followill of Fox Sports Net, Mike Rice of CSN Northwest, Ramona Shelburne of ESPN, Stephanie Reddy and Steve Martin of Fox Sports Carolinas, Eddie Johnson of Fox Sports Arizona, Phil Chenier of Comcast Sportsnet, Sam Smith of Bulls.com, and Gary Washburn of the Boston Globe. Then there's Israel Gutierrez of ESPN, who had Kawhi Leonard third on his MVP ballot, second to only LeBron James amongst forwards, but then chose to put Kawhi Leonard on his All-NBA second team behind Draymond Green of the Golden State Warriors. Next we have Chuck Cooperstein of ESPN Radio, Joel Myers of Fox Sports New Orleans, and Steve Buckhantz of CSN Mid-Atlantic, who had Kawhi Leonard second, third, or fourth on their MVP ballot, first amongst forwards, but then chose to put Kawhi Leonard on their All-NBA second team behind LeBron James and Kevin Durant. Then there's Mark Stein of ESPN and Sean Kelly of WRNO Radio, who had Kevin Durant fourth on their MVP ballot, second to only Kawhi Leonard amongst forwards, but then put Kevin Durant on their All-NBA second team behind LeBron James of the Cleveland Cavaliers. Meanwhile, Stephen Bundy of the New York Daily News had Kevin Durant third on his MVP ballot, second to only LeBron James amongst forwards, but then chose to put Kevin Durant on his All-NBA second team behind Kawhi Leonard of the San Antonio Spurs. Next we have Steve Holman of Hawks Radio Network and Jeff McDonald of the San Antonio Express News, who had LeBron James third or fourth on their MVP ballot, second to only Kawhi Leonard amongst forwards, and in Steve Holman's case, chose to put LeBron James on his All-NBA second team behind Draymond Green of the Golden State Warriors, while Jeff McDonald had LeBron James on his All-NBA second team behind Kevin Durant of the Oklahoma City Thunder. Then there's Brian Davis of Fox Sports Oklahoma, who also gave LeBron James a fourth place MVP vote, second to only Kevin Durant amongst forwards, but then put LeBron James on his All-NBA second team behind Kawhi Leonard of the San Antonio Spurs. Next is Mike Fratello of TNT, who had Draymond Green of the Golden State Warriors second on his MVP ballot, first amongst forwards, but then chose to put Draymond Green on his All-NBA second team behind LeBron James of the Cleveland Cavaliers and LaMarcus Aldridge of the San Antonio Spurs. Antonio Harvey of Fox Sports Radio, on the other hand, had Draymond Green fourth on his MVP ballot, second to only Kawhi Leonard amongst forwards, but then put Draymond Green on his All-NBA second team behind LeBron James of the Cleveland Cavaliers. Meanwhile, Fred McLeod of SiriusXM Radio also had Draymond Green fourth on his MVP ballot, second to only LeBron James amongst forwards, but then chose to put Draymond Green on his All-NBA third team behind Kevin Durant, Anthony Davis, and Kawhi Leonard. Next, we have Gary Washburn of the Boston Globe, who had Damian Lillard of the Portland Trail Blazers fourth on his MVP ballot, third to only Stephen Curry and Russell Westbrook amongst guards, but then put Damian Lillard on his All-NBA third team behind James Harden of the Houston Rockets and Kyle Lowry of the Toronto Raptors. Meanwhile, Jerry Zagdola of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune and Steve Martin of Fox Sports Carolinas had Damian Lillard fourth or fifth on their MVP ballot, second to only Stephen Curry amongst guards, but then chose to put Damian Lillard on their All-NBA second team behind Russell Westbrook of the Oklahoma City Thunder. Now the next set of voters are those who had Chris Paul of the Los Angeles Clippers second, fourth, or fifth on their MVP ballot, second to only Stephen Curry amongst guards, but then put Chris Paul on their All-NBA second team behind Russell Westbrook. These voters are Ken Berger of CBS Sports, Kevin Calabro of ESPN Radio, Ralph Lauer of Prime Ticket, Tim Kempton of KTAR Radio, Andre Aldrich of Fox Sports South, Dante Marchitelli of Fox Sports Florida, Jim Peterson of Fox Sports North, Aaron Falk of the Salt Lake Tribune, Chris Marlowe of Altitude Sports, Fran Blindberry of NBA.com, and Doris Burke as well as Zach Lowe of ESPN. Next, we have Eric Hasseltine of ESPN Radio, who had Kyle Lowry of the Toronto Raptors fourth on his MVP ballot, third to only Stephen Curry and Russell Westbrook amongst guards, but then kept Kyle Lowry completely off of his All-NBA second or third team ballot. Meanwhile, Tim Reynolds of the Associated Press had James Harden fourth on his MVP ballot, second to only Stephen Curry amongst guards, but then kept James Harden completely off of his All-NBA teams altogether. It's also important to note that James Harden's highest MVP vote, which was for third place, came from none other than Houston Rockets' play-by-play announcer, Bill Worrell. Now, while all of these voters are certainly entitled to their own opinions, these opinions, if they're to be taken seriously, should not only be educated, but consistent. And what we've seen from these 2015-16 NBA ballots is that many of the media members don't take the voting process as seriously as they should, which is to be expected considering the fact that they aren't being held accountable by their own peers or even by the NBA itself.
When you have the kind of year you had last year statistically, and you don't get named to any All-NBA teams, A, did you take it as a slight, and B, did it serve as any motivation for you at all this summer?
Like I said, I get motivation from anything. Yeah, but I mean, when the last time that happened, someone averaged, 29, 7, and 6, and didn't make any NBA team. But motivation, that's it. Just gotta be better. You don't blame anybody. You don't criticize anybody or what should have been done. You look in the mirror, look at yourself, and say, be better for next year.